This is Justice Warriors, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 26. My name's Andy and I'm joined as usual by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
Hi. So this episode is called Race and Forgiveness. It comes along after a couple of other episodes about race. We did race in the Bible, and then we did an episode which we called Race and Our Identity, which was really about the three of us and how we see our identity in the context of race. And through some of the race stuff and other episodes, the concept of forgiveness was mentioned, and it's very scary to talk about. There's a load of pitfalls, and we feel very intimidated to talk about it, but we're going to give it a try in this episode. And we will confess to you, this is our second attempt at recording this episode.
26B.
And
at least our fourth talk about the topic or something.
Yeah. So we've been trying to do this, but we think we might be able to come up with something vaguely coherent. We'll certainly give it a go. If you're listening to this, listener, we obviously thought it was vaguely coherent. So we're going to try and talk about where forgiveness fits in into this picture of like historical sin and the lasting effects and inequalities and things that are still coming through from the kind of racist behaviour, and how whether forgiveness fits into that story, and if so, how. So we had a bit of homework. Our homework was to read or listen to a story from a project called the Forgiveness Project. So, Jörg, would you mind telling us a little bit about what the Forgiveness Project is, and then telling us your response to the story that you read?
Sure. I don't really know too much about it, but we did come upon it because Keith mentioned it to us in the episode we did with him. And I've had a look, and it all revolves around collecting stories about the F word, as they call it. So kind of looking at forgiveness in its many dimensions and how it often heals very significant rifts and very significant guilt of what some people have done to others. Some episodes talk about forgiveness. There's loads and loads. Some episodes talk about how forgiveness frees up yourself from a certain past. Others are a bit more open-ended. Others describe a struggle that they're still going through. So very interesting stories. So I encourage you to take a look. And we set ourselves the homework to pick one story that we thought was particularly interesting or that we wanted to talk about. So I took an interest in the stories that came from Africa, and one that particularly stood out to me was by Odongtu Jimmy, who was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. This is sort of a very fanatical army around a distorted version of Christianity that lives on child soldiers. So basically, they abduct children, beat them into submission, and make them complicit by telling them to kill people or get killed themselves, and then train them up to become child soldiers. And this is Odongtu's story as well, that he gets kidnapped. He's first instructed to beat an old man to death who's riding around on a bicycle. That's his only sin, because the Lord's Resistance Army is afraid of people on bicycles because they can ferry messages fairly quickly between villages. So he bludgeons this man to death with other boys, and then he's trained up to soldier and begins to shoot others while he himself is suffering. And in the end, he manages to run away and is now in the middle of sort of trying to rebuild his life. He began to doubt the rebels, he says. He tried to escape. He ran, and he found himself at government barracks. They interrogated us and integrated him into a returnees rehabilitation project. And what really stuck out at me in this whole story is that it really points to how complicated something like forgiveness is. Is he going to forgive his perpetrators who made him complicit? He has a lot of forgiveness to receive. Where's that forgiveness going to come from? And the interlocking of lives, the tragic interlocking of lives through the acts of the Lord's Resistance Army and his own are just going to stay. I mean, that's nothing you're going to paper over forgiveness. If anything, you can find some sort of a healing or an integration. So I thought that was a really, really deep story, and it really touched me.
Thank you. Yeah, so I looked for a British story in the hope of connecting with it. So I found a story of Paul Kola, who was just living an ordinary life in his ordinary house when some people burst through the door and beat him almost to death, and left him with permanent disfigurement. But much more traumatic was that his wife and daughter's boyfriend were in the house, so he feared for their lives, and they feared for his life. So his daughter and the boyfriend blockaded themselves in the bedroom upstairs, and she thought that her parents were being murdered. And his wife was held down and threatened and absolutely terrified. He was really badly beaten, and there was no explanation for this, like why this had happened. It was mistaken identity, something like that. Some kind of gang thing or something. So it's just kind of the ultimate suburban nightmare, right? That you're just living your life and then this awful thing happens to you. So he struck me as being like a kind of soft liberal like me, like he was all about the he was doing a much better job of it than I would in those circumstances, I'm sure, but he was all about like being a nice person about this awful thing that had happened to him. So these four men who broke into his house were Polish, and there was a kind of backlash against Polish people in the media. And he was he worked really hard to try and avoid that. The thing he said that struck him initially was a load of Polish people kept apologising to him, and like on behalf of their community. So it was this very weird thing. But they then went through a restorative justice program. So they went and visited one of the perpetrators of this horrific crime in prison, and got to say to him what they wanted to say, or ask of him what they wanted to ask. And it's really well worth listening to the rest of the story. I won't do the whole of the rest of the story, but the people who ran the restorative justice program, which is called "Why Me," which is he said was his question, said to him, forgiveness is never the goal. You shouldn't be looking to forgive through this process. You should be looking to say or ask what you want to ask, I guess was the point. But he said that he eventually found forgiveness and some of the freedom that brought. But again, it was a very complicated type of forgiveness. It wasn't like it's all over, but it was... He said he was left with this question of why me, and his wife wanted to say stuff to this person, and his daughter wanted to ask what this person was going to do to change his life in future, which is what they ended up talking about a lot in that conversation. But it was a healing conversation for him, and he ended up in some kind of something he would call forgiveness out of it, and it brought him some kind of peace about it, I think.
I find that interesting. I wonder if we get to it, because it like humanizing the other is a way of understanding, like you seeing their struggle, their motivations, their brokenness, and in some ways that makes it somewhat more comprehensible.
Yeah. So his daughter had to leave their house. She couldn't stay there because of the trauma. And after meeting this person and in some way understanding why or that this person was a person, she was then able to move back in.
Wow.
So it really made a meaningful difference to her life.
Wow.
It's an amazing story, and he seems to be an amazing person. I don't know how he's so big-hearted, but yeah. Well, how about you, Leah?
So just to get the name of that guy again, Paul Kola, was it?
Paul Kola, Kohler.
Okay, look for that. So I've read a story by a Belarusian lady called Irina. It was really interesting. Her husband, it seems, was done away with by the regime, but nobody really knows what actually happened to him. So it's that horrible case of missing person. He was with and friends with a prominent politician, and they both went missing at the same time. What was really interesting about, and I'd actually just like to read quickly a little bit of what she said. She said, "It's easier to forgive when you don't know who has hurt you, because then it remains abstract," which is interesting. But in my case, I know exactly who the perpetrators are, i.e. the Belarusian government. If you know who did it, but there is no acknowledgement and no accountability, then forgiveness is not possible. Forgiveness requires justice. The perpetrators need to be punished, imprisoned, and publicly convicted. With justice, I could forgive, and then I could start to put the perpetrators far away from my mind. So I just thought that was really interesting, because it's probably quite different to what we think of as a typically Christian view of forgiveness, but it's obviously a very real account and experience from her life and what had happened.
Yeah, and like the idea of like forgiving like a system that is completely unrepentant. That sounds difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that need for justice. Really interesting.
I do wonder if, like you said, maybe something to talk about more, but whether in those places it does come in handy to push that off more toward God, to say, God, I'm just going to forgive you or the universe that this has happened to me, because I can't address the perpetrator with it, but I need to place it down somewhere.
Yeah, it's God in that sense. God is just someone to talk to about it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so yeah, justice. Maybe justice will thread in through this discussion.
It's not. Our podcast. I don't know. Justice doesn't seem central for us, does it?
Justify those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. To justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
Okay, so that was homework. So now we're going to move on to our What Are Your Worries section.
Are you impressed? I did my homework and I managed to make it on theme. Justice.
Yes. Yes.
Be
That's very
impressed.
good.
I'm very impressed.
I'm glad Jörg noticed.
I did. I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to make you feel self-conscious about it.
That I'd actually managed it. And, anyway, sorry, go on.
So Leah, we're going to ask you first. What are your worries?
Because you did
about
the
this-
homework, you get the first
about
question.
race
Yeah, I
and
get the
forgiveness.
first
Yeah,
questions. That's my reward.
top of the class.
Thanks. So, my worry about... Well, we've talked a lot about God and sin and justice, of course, and how we've all changed the way that we look at all of those things. And so as I've been through this process of thinking about God differently and thinking about sin differently, I've had less and less use for this concept that God can forgive our sins. And the more I think about it, the more I find it somewhat redundant. So that's probably the beginning of my worry. I think the fact that we've laboured over this episode for quite a number of hours is just really interesting, that this concept of forgiveness is so central to the gospel, and we talk about it so glibly and so quickly so often, and yet it's taken us quite some time to try and get near to unpacking it. And I think that when we have a very straightforward notion of big bad God on the throne, we've all done horrible things that displease him, and so he had to send Jesus and kill his son to make it all right, then forgiveness fits really neatly and easily into that, right? It's kind of, oh yeah, well, God has to forgive us because Jesus, made that possible, and there we go. It's like a really neat little parcel. And then once you start unraveling those strands of thinking about God differently and the cross differently, and then I'm sort of, it's kind of all unraveled in front of me, and I'm sitting with this big jumble of threads and not quite sure how forgiveness fits in.
Is it fair to say that this is, especially because once you start to think about forgiveness and race, like, what are we talking about? Yeah, God, you'll forgive us for enslaving people and it'll all be good and the sin will be done. Like, then all of a sudden you just realize, what's that going to do? And all the systemic things, and what does that even mean for the Rhodes Must Fall debate or decolonizing debates or whatever we're going through right now? Like, how does this translate, this sort of...
Well, yeah, because that neat little story that we just I mentioned, is very much about individual sin, isn't it? I've done bad things that God is angry with, and something huge and involving lots of different communities and lots of different people across lots of different periods of time. Just doesn't compute in all that, does it?
Yeah. That's interesting, though. Sorry, I find it fascinating because, I mean, the Old Testament is full of this sort of generational sin idea, but we don't tend to think a lot about how Jesus' forgiveness would take care of generational damage and sin.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, we read Old Testament stories about communal things, community-wide things, and we interpret them as how should I respond to this as an individual?
Absolutely. Yeah. We've talked about this in the climate change episode, right? That we've completely lost the idea of collective sin over the narrow idea of forgiveness and sin that we have. Yeah.
So what does collective forgiveness look like?
Yeah, on the issue of racism of all places, like how does how do you repent of a system that we're participating in without actually condoning any bit of it? And yet our very settlement patterns are a testimony to race.
Yeah, and so how can we turn to God, get wiped clean, and it's all over?
And it's all over. Yeah. We haven't moved house.
Yeah,
That's clear.
So this leads on actually quite neatly to my worry. So my worry is that we often talk about sin being a debt that is owed, and the problem I have with that metaphor, similar by the way to being washed as white as snow, is when you pay off a debt, the balance is zero, and there's nothing left. And if you think about race and colonialism and stuff like that, there isn't a way of reversing the sin that has happened and is established and is still kind of bearing fruit right now. You can't just pay it off, and especially you can't pay it off by an abstract concept of Jesus died, so now it's gone. It's not gone.
And I do think one of the problems with that metaphor is the translation between the ancient world and the modern one. So for us, a debt can be an entirely impersonal thing that we might owe for our house or our car to an institution that doesn't have a face for us. However, in the ancient world, debts were much more part of a whole series of familial and communal and village-wide obligations that people would have had to one another. So you might pay off a debt, but it was much more like, owing you owed your kids some money or something. There's an ongoing relationship that is then affected even when that debt is paid off.
Yeah. Like if your, I don't know, parents or aunt help you with the down payment of the house, and even if at some point they forgive that debt, you're still going to have to call them up every Christmas. Like there's an obligation that remains that you can't easily forget, like with the bank.
Yeah, that's right. And so, you pointed out to me last time we talked about this, one of the previous times we talked about this, that there's a difference between paying off a debt and forgiving a debt. So I think one of the particularly damaging ideas for me is the idea that Jesus paid off the debt rather than forgiving the debt, right? Yeah. That really seems unhelpful to me, at least in this this conversation.
Yeah. But that comes back to the whole retributive justice thing that we talked about in our sin and forgiveness episodes that I also just don't find very helpful. If we really want to take serious that gap between crucifixion and resurrection, when it wasn't clear what would happen, that God was dead for 3 days, then it's not this kind of, let me just pay it off. It really is a new life breaking through that was unexpected. It's much more forgiving than a payment.
Yeah. Cool. What about your worries, Jörg?
I have two, but they're kind of connected, and they're quite close to the question of race. And I'll give an example for that shortly. But the two are, I started thinking about this really strange bind of asking others for forgiveness, and I know this sank our last attempt to record this episode, really. Because it just led us down to this spiral of, if I'm asking somebody for forgiveness, am I not almost, especially if it's between Christians, am I not almost demanding that they make it whole? Like there's a really, really weird bind that happens if I go and ask for forgiveness. And the other bit is the question of superficial forgiveness is my other worry, that we can make forgiveness, especially in Christianity, we can make it a highly symbolic act, which has very little to do with changing the structures of that need to be addressed. And my example for both of this is the so-called Memphis Miracle. We actually talked about this a bit in the Keith episode, that one of the things that Keith was studying was global Pentecostalism, which began as this movement of an African-American pastor, but then, and it was racially integrated in Los Angeles, like really ahead of its time in 1906. But then as time rolled on, it just didn't take much more than a few months, a couple of years really, until white people pulled out of that black-led movement, established their own churches, and you have that segregation took hold of the church. And then in 1994, Pentecostal churches got together, and there was an act of reconciliation that was done, and it happened in Memphis. It was the so-called Memphis Miracle, and a new community was formed, that community of Pentecostal churches to integrate black and white churches. White pastors are kneeling before black pastors washing their feet. It's a lovely symbolic act, but of course all of this was pre-negotiated as well. And what does this mean? Like how is forgiveness given in that act when there is sort of this almost this demand to let go of the past? How much of that has been talked about? Does forgiveness need to be offered freely in that very act of washing somebody's feet? Or you're not putting them on a spot to make it right here, even if they're perhaps not ready for this? And the second thing then, race, as we all know, still plays a huge role in American evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, despite the Memphis Miracle, because the structural issues were never addressed. It was, sure, these churches are now together, but it was like sort of papered over by a symbolic act, but there wasn't enough talking about what led to this in the first place. What white people owed black people, how Pentecostalism was complicit in the sins of America. None of this really came out, and it still plagues the movement to this day. We had a really, really cool article for the encyclopedia that I edited on Pentecostalism, on racism, that talks about all of these things, and you realize that nearly 30 years out from the Memphis Miracle, none of this is gone.
Yeah, and we can imagine it. The Church of England has owned up to institutional racism. I think that's right, isn't it? Yeah. And that's really important. But you can imagine a similar feeling of like, now we've dealt with that.
Right.
We're fine.
Right.
And
yet, when you look at how the church engages globally with one another on controversial issues, there's very much a power play that follows the established structure of our world. So yeah, you can do all these things, but it doesn't mean you escape from the sin.
Yeah. I guess it's probably also worth saying that doesn't mean that it's not important or reaching for something important.
Absolutely, yeah.
But yeah.
It's just a worry, it's not a condemnation.
Yeah. But yeah, that it is a worry, isn't it?
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
Okay, now I'm going to move us on to our key ideas section. So, Leah, one of the questions that's been plaguing you through all of our conversations about this is, why do we ask God for forgiveness when it's other people that we've hurt? So, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of trying to get past that notion of we need to ask God forgiveness because he's so cross with us. And what I think one of the things that's been helping me is that picture of Jesus on the cross who just says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's just a really interesting notion from Jesus that not only kind of for forgiveness, but just that we're not really aware of the depths of our need and our sin. So that's one thing that I found helpful. The other thing I've been thinking about is that perhaps what Jesus enables us to do by offering us forgiveness is more about something useful for us than it is something that God needs. That we need some way of breaking the guilt and shame and torture that we go through because of the things that we've done and the things that have upset people and caused them hurt. And that maybe part of why we need forgiveness from God is for those times when other people can't or won't, or like that lady. So and that lady from Belarus, just other people weren't interested in the situation. So yeah, that's kind of where I've started to go. Not sure I've got all that far.
Yeah, but it's a real problem, isn't it? And that we are in the Bible, we're never really told to ask others for forgiveness. We're told to forgive others. We're sometimes told to reconcile with others if we know they have a problem with us. But maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But just the idea that we're supposed to ask first and foremost forgiveness to God. I still find myself rebelling against it somewhat. Imagine, especially on the race issue, right? Here we are. What are we supposed to do in a church when race still plagues us to a good degree, like the way it manifests in various injustices? Some of the things we've talked about on our podcast as well. And then we sit in church and we say to God, forgive us our sin of racism. I think you're absolutely right. This is an important confession. It's an important articulation. It's an important coming to God and getting that healing from it. But at the same level, it feels so unnatural to direct that to God rather than to the person we've hurt.
Yeah, so we were looking at an example in the Bible where King David, It's a story people may well know about, where he basically has a man killed because he fancies his wife.
He has fancied his wife at this point already. I mean, he still fancies her, but he's already,
Yeah. The act has already occurred. And he's confronted by one of God's prophets, who tells a neat little parable that, and the thing that gets me about this story is the wife kind of fades into the background quite quickly. The parable doesn't really mention her, neither do many of the kind of forthcoming verses, but trying to move on from the fact that it's all written from a man's perspective, that he's confronted with this thing he's done, and he very much feels like he has sinned against God. It's very, very strong. Against you only, God, have I sinned, and God sort of seems to go along with that in the story. He says, "Well, David, I've given you this and that. I've given you all of Judah and Israel, and I've made you the king." And you saw, and it has overtones of the Garden of Eden. Really, you saw the kind of the one thing that wasn't yours, and you went for it. And you what does he say? You've despised the Lord, I think is the words he used. You kind of, it's that sort of feeling of taken for granted all the amazing things I've given you. So it's very much portrayed as an interaction between David and God, and about David's relationship with God.
And it's quite hard to get over the offensiveness of this story, right? Which we're trying to do, but it's worth saying, as you mentioned, Leah, like the way the woman is treated as property, and also the son that gets killed as punishment is just treated as David's property, and that, you know, the real. So it kind of, this, even the meaning that we're trying to get out of this, when David says it's you and you only I've sinned against, even that feels to me like that's just David writing the humans out of the story and just being sort of self-obsessed and things like that. But I wonder whether there's something in, like you say, God goes along with it, but, you know, of course the whole thing was written by men. But God does seem to accept that, or say that these things are against him.
Well, the thing is, Nathan's challenge to David is all about what God has given him, right? So in the idea of an ancient king, it was very well within the rights of David to take a woman if he fancied her. It was very well in the rights of an ancient king to send people to war, which he did to her husband, and place him in the front lines and get rid of people they didn't like. So in some sense, this was... he was entitled to do this, and the argument that Nathan, the prophet, makes toward him is, God has put you in a position where you had those powers. Look now at how you wielded them. Look now at what you've done. God has given you all of these resources. What have you done with it? And then David realizes, my gosh, you know, like that's the point he gets really convicted, because he realizes, okay, yes, I may have exercised my rights to get what I want as king, but actually I was placed in this position of power to do something else. And in some ways I wonder if that is actually then helpful for us to think about in the context of race, to say, okay, there is an element here in which we're not just invited to think about what we did to other people, but what we've done to God's Garden of Eden. We've been blessed with so many different things. And we've talked about this before, that colonialism begins to some extent as a helping project, and it morphs, and it is an overreach, it's a paternalistic overreach, it kind of naturally moves into that. Slavery, not quite. Slavery still has a different root, but the racism that comes out of colonialism comes out of a deep motivation to break slavery at first and help people, and then it turns into this, like, they're not capable. So you're realizing, wait a minute, we have abused a place of power so much. We're living in such a systemic sin that it goes a lot deeper than just something that people did 150 years ago that I now despise. There's something deeper in us that makes us do this.
And does the thinking about it being against God help us to think about it as a deeper thing?
Yeah,
Perhaps
I
it
think it
does.
helps. I think through these conversations, it's helped me to think of God as being in place of our essential humanity, or you could say God's image in us, right? So, if David said, "I've sinned against God's image in me and God's image in me only," if you see what I mean, something like that, that would make more sense to me. Like it's like my essential humanity demands that I treat people well, and I've kind of failed that image of God in me. That makes more sense to me than, and that I think fits with what you're saying about the Garden of Eden.
But all of this only works if I really understand the depth of systemic sin, because then I do bring my brother back in. But if it becomes this, because I then see this as a part, like I have a different vision of how the world could have been, and look at how much I've betrayed this brother. I'm not just in the bind to this brother, I'm actually in the bind to all of the universe in how I've behaved. But if we are stuck, like you were saying, Andy, in the story of forgiveness being this personal transaction between me and God, then it's utterly flat. And it's actually very hurtful and damning to make it between me and God when I have yet to realize the depth of the sin that I'm living in every day. So is it bound to a true act of repentance, in which we actually also realize the heritage that we have inherited and the things that need to be righted once we actually have come to terms with how deep the rabbit hole goes? Quote the Matrix.
And Leah, you listened to the episode on sin and said it was a really helpful way to start thinking about this episode. When I say the episode on sin, I mean our episode of our podcast about sin.
Yeah, and I think a little bit like you were saying, we try to move away from this notion of sin as being our individual stealing the cookie from the cookie jar act, and try to look at sin as a condition that the world exists in, a system of history and institutions and things that have grown up over time that we're caught in. And if forgiveness can be part of finding some kind of freedom from those restrictions.
And if we go a bit further from that, like I still find it uncomfortable to talk about it this way, because I hear with the other, I hear like, okay, you just kind of spiritualize the whole thing, when it actually is very, very practical, very real. When we think about forgiveness and race, I'm slightly consoled by the fact that we no longer have this awkward thing like walking up to, like in the Memphis Miracle, to an African American community in this case, or an African community, say, "Forgive us so we can move on." Like there's a real awfulness in that as well. But the thing that I wanted to bring this to is that asking God for forgiveness or receiving forgiveness from God is actually then to enable us to do something else, not demand or ask forgiveness by somebody else, but work toward restitution. And this is where we have this amazing story by Zacchaeus, the tax collector, lovely Sunday school character because he was a wee little man and he couldn't see Jesus and he'd climb up on a tree, so a very hands-on kind of story. So this tiny man works for the Romans. Everybody makes fun of the tiny man. He must have been a very difficult character, and he works for the enemy. And tax collecting basically meant you paid somebody else rent, and then you had a piece of road to harass everybody else on. And that's what he did for work. And Jesus goes to his house. So that moment, like he sees him wanting to see Jesus, he looks up and says, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." That's an act of forgiveness. Like the guy who is excluded from the community gets the hero invited in his house. He gets to see the Messiah. But then what happens is really cool. People say, what is Jesus doing? He's in the house of a sinner. And then it says in Luke 19, "But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, 'Look, Lord, here now I give half of my possession to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount.'" And then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek what was lost." Salvation comes to the house in the moment that this person takes this received forgiveness and translates it into his life. And I find that fascinating. Imagine if we asked for forgiveness about the racial sins of our forefathers right before a workshop of how to restitute museum goods. Like, if you thought these things, or like right before a workshop on how the Church of England can do more to promote, more diversity to bishopry or something like that,
or how rich countries could pay money for some of the riches that have been stolen.
Yeah, how we could have migration as an actual counterweight to the way the world is structured, so that through remittances rather than phony development aid that ends up in the wrong hands, we can redistribute the wealth that we have gained from colonialism. I mean, there's lots.
That's brave.
Yeah, well, we should have an honest conversation about migration at some point.
Yeah, no, it's a really good argument, isn't it? This sense that they're kind of invading our space, that, well, hold on, we created that space
unless we need them to drive our petrol around.
Well, yeah, of course. But we created this space, this country, partly by enslaving and stealing, and yet we can't possibly allow people in to share it with us.
Absolutely.
There's no room left anymore.
Or we did it for a while, so-called Windrush generation that Keith also talked about, and then we forgot about our commitments. I mean, at least at the end of Empire, there was still a sense that you had a right to come to the center of Empire to work and make your living.
Well, that's why we've had the problem, isn't it? Because it was seen at that point as being just something that you did, that you travelled within Empire.
It was your right. Yeah.
And it was your right to travel, and you didn't necessarily need some kind of document to let you in. And then now suddenly we're saying, well, where were your documents? Well,
exactly. Yeah,
it wasn't relevant at the time.
Exactly. So what does restitution even look like? Yeah.
So Zacchaeus got salvation or maybe forgiveness via restitution.
And then, I mean, if you think about it that way, then the act of forgiveness is something between the other person and God. Like we are to ask God for forgiveness and then work toward restitution as a way to righting the wrong that we've done. So we're not supposed to let our sisters and brothers go empty-handed in this, but we're not there to demand forgiveness. We're there to do what we can so they can offer forgiveness.
So this is such a contrast with the picture of forgiveness that we often hear about in churches in a couple of ways. Firstly, in the sense that this the kind of story of forgiveness. Normally, forgiveness is like the end bit, right? Like I forgave them, or they forgave me, and then we were all right. And I guess we're talking about forgiveness, A, not being just like an event, a one-time event, but B, being the kind of beginning of the journey of relationship building or restitution or whatever.
That's a really good point, because that then means we need to have a Memphis Miracle every day in the States, or we need to have, colonialism needs to feature more strongly in our confessions on Sundays. Imagine church that did that.
Yeah.
But we have to realize that we're living in the structure of sin in which we require God's forgiveness every day, so we can go out oriented properly into our day and say, what's my act of restitution today? Even if it's just taking care of a homeless person I see on my way to work or something, like just understanding how deep involved in these structures of sin we are. And
that's why I think it's so biblical that the act of forgiveness, asking God for forgiveness and forgiving others is always seems to be so entwined, because we forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, to the measure that we're able to labour and work and see the difficulty in forgiving other people, we labour in that same conversation with God about having our own sins forgiven. God doesn't waver. Say we've done something really terrible, that we very personally that we feel awful about. God doesn't wave a magic wand and makes all our guilt and shame for that go away, does he? That's got to be an ongoing conversation that does that work in the same way that us forgiving other people is. And only as we know the pain and the difficulty of forgiving the things that we feel we've been hurt in, we can kind of continue in that process in both directions, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. Because otherwise it just is the sort of cheap band-aid that we put over something without actually having looked at the wound.
Yeah, and I think God knows that. So he knows that if we just say, oh, God, forgive our sins, it might be just too easy. But if we link it to our ongoing process of forgiving other people for the things that they've done for us, that also has to... The pain transfers, the two things are also...
All right, that's a good point. So that we have to learn about... we have to learn about the pain that we inflict through reflecting on the pain and letting go of the pain that others have inflicted on us. That's an interesting point.
Otherwise, one's too easy. It just becomes God's forgiven me, I'll walk away now. I've done with that.
So, Leah, how does this fit in with the kind of argument of in terms of race and things like that, like it's time to move on, like we've these bad things happened in the past and we'll never heal unless we start to move on from that?
I've been reading a book that suggests just that, called The Madness of Crowds by a guy called Douglas Murray, who sort of says that we need to learn to forget these things. And he makes some valid points about social media and how things are kind of constantly thrown up and things in the past are taken out of context. And some of that is perfectly valid, but I just don't think it's the right of us to sit there and say, oh, these things just need to be forgiven, when we know, it's like we were saying before, asking for forgiveness is maybe not a very biblical idea. We know that there hasn't been restitution and restoration and changing of structure. So how can we demand that these things just get forgotten? But on the other hand, there has to be some break to the endless cycle, or else, in 500 years' time, we're just all going to be totally weighed down, even more than we are now. Think of all the historical situations that we all struggle with now. My sister's been doing some academic work about Palestine, and one of the things that she has found in her research is how present to current, present day Palestinians, how present things like the Balfour Declaration are in their consciousness and in their thinking. So much so that when they meet British people, it's something that they very frequently bring up. So I think... Did
you learn about that in school, the Balfour Declaration? Does it come in British schools?
Yeah, I did, because I did in A-level.
I didn't.
I did in A-level history. We did some stuff about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So
I learned about the English kings.
I always get the impression that the English learn their history through German Nazis or something. Like that's how you learn historical orientation, the fascism and
we did
the others.
We do the Tudors and we do the dictators. That's kind of most of it.
I did James the First used to stand in a deer, a freshly killed deer to help some problem with his feet. And stuff like that,
right.
and then in what was supposed to be my personal social education lessons, my teacher didn't like doing that, so he did the Nazis in those lessons.
Okay. Oh, that's a strange teacher then.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't want to go into.
Okay, that's
quite how strange.
Yeah.
No, we did do about it a bit, but not to the extent that to this. I mean, I'm just thinking of a particular conversation she recounted, and to this guy, it was it was like it happened yesterday, you know. And so if in 500 years' time, 1,000 years' time, we're going to have even more of these kind, there has to be some break.
But it's there because it's never
cycle.
acknowledged. Like the Balfour Declaration runs so deep because it's seen as the stab in the back that has never been righted, right? So,
well, I suppose it's like the Lady Irena that I read about. You know, how can she forgive when there's been no justice and no acknowledgement of the perpetrator?
Oh, wow. That is a painful and accurate comparison.
Wow. Yeah. So the problem isn't that social media doesn't forget. The problem is that there's no room for articulating forgiveness and doing restitution on social media. We need like a forgiveness Twitter or something to kind of... Because, I mean, I get the worry. You end up in the sort of fragmenting of identities, and everybody will find some sort of grudge, and some will be a lot bigger and a lot more legitimate than others. But we can all find some pain to wallow in. Again, some of those will be very illegitimate, others will be legitimate. But what do you do with it? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, so are we getting to what you don't do is ask for / demand forgiveness or ask people to forget or move on. But you follow Zacchaeus' example and try and do some restitution.
Yeah, and maybe part of the problem as well is that we forget that racism negatively impacts us all. So you know, when we see it as somebody else's problem and we categorize these, you know, we're the white people, they're the not white people, we're the ones that have done historically the bad stuff, and it's obviously clearly not at all that clear cut, because actually we all suffer because of these injustices. And I mean, a little bit like we've talked a bit about masculinity before, you know, all men and all women suffer because of this weird notion of what an ideally male man is like and how he ought to act and show power in the world. Yeah, everybody suffers because of that, and it's the same with racism. So when we stand in that place of being the ones that need to forgive and also the ones that need to be forgiven, does that not start to break down those?
But when you suffer, you mean lose out in one way or another,
Yeah,
right?
we all-
I mean,
we
because the
all lose
suffering
out.
is unequal.
It's totally unequal. Yeah, but we all do. You know, if I live in a society where a black child that lives in my town who is a very individualistic. It's just a story at the top of my head, okay? But you know, say that child has some amazing gift that they don't get to kind of fully, you know, work out because of the way that society treats them.
Yeah,
the whole of society loses out, right?
Yeah,
it's back to the Garden of Eden thing, right? You know, in our kind of perfected state, or like God in us, we would all be like enjoying the fruits of relationships with each other richly.
Yeah,
no, you're right.
Miss out on being able to have good relationships with people because of their skin color. I miss out as much as, not as much as, you're right, it is totally unequal, but I miss out too.
Yeah. And it's you're right. I'm reading an interesting little novel at the moment that was written in 1920 by a guy who served as a German colonial officer in German East Africa. I think he also went in the First World War, and he turned pacifist and totally against colonialism. So he wrote in early 1920s, Hans Pascha is his name. He wrote a story of an African from a fictional African country, sounds a bit Swahili-ish, visiting Germany and writing how strange everything is. And you just realize what we've missed out from not learning another culture, because he writes about, like, imagine these foreigners, because they don't like that it takes 4 days to walk from A to B, they put metal on the ground, sent this big thing along, and then they need a guy to drive the big thing, another guy to fire the big thing, another guard to protect it. For these guys, they have to build houses. They need to cut deeper and deeper in the woods to do that. Then they need insurances for this. So he kind of describes how there's a whole crazy economy that revolves around this. Very foresightful, like 100 years ahead of his time, as it were. And you kind of read this, and then he says, is it idiotic? All so they can save 3 days of walking. And you realize, actually, there's a chance lost in learning from others that we completely that some people saw in colonialism. Some people saw that. And most people missed it because they were so blinded by racism.
I mean,
And I wonder what the opportunity... Yeah.
Oh, sorry, because I've had a particularly bruising week on building sites, and like the whole of everywhere loses out because of the macho posturing in building sites. You know, it does not make for good ways to do things,
Right.
because all people are very often concerned with is making sure they don't get blamed for what goes wrong.
Right.
And you know, there's an amount of that is due to the fact that it's all men. Sorry. And diversity would, all white men pretty much, diversity would help that. Everybody would get along better.
And similar to how we were talking about whiteness last episode, it's men with a particular idea in mind of what the ideal is, right? And so I think in what you're saying about how much racism hurts all of us, I think, you know, whiteness is really relevant to that. You know, like.
And if you look at, like, even in practical terms, the whole museum good restitution movement, a lot of this is unbelievably complex because these things were often bought, but they were bought in strange circumstances, or they were spoils of war, so in international law, etc., etc. But in a lot of ways, actually, museums don't even know what's in there. So, like, we're only talking about the tip of the iceberg. So I know from German museums, for example, there's stuff that's just hiding in collections. People don't even know what's there. So if we were to have an honest conversation about this, even just finding out about the artifacts that are there, we could learn so much about ourselves and the way we structure this world and the effect that racism has had. But instead, I took students to the British Museum, for example, and it was this exhibition about religion, beautifully done. This is some years ago, Living with the Gods or something it was called. And it was like a comparative thing about different artifacts. So in the middle of this very disembodied exhibit about religion, there's this one chalice, and it's at Magdala around 1870. If you know your Ethiopian history, you know the British went in an expedition because the king had taken some British hostages, the Ethiopian king, and they basically gunned down his palace, he commits suicide, and then all the spoils end up in Britain. This is how the British Museum in 17 or 18 presented a chalice from Ethiopia and talked about religion. Like this
well, they had none of it. They had none of that story.
They had none of that story there. Yeah. None of that story was there. You go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, there they have an exhibition about Magdala. It's very well done because they tell you the whole backstory and what happened and how these things got in the museum hands. And yet another step further is a restitution that happened last week of some of the artifacts taken at that time. So even just having the conversation around it would enlighten you so much more than just putting it in some phony exhibition about gods, which tells you nothing about human existence. There's nothing you learn out of this. And if we were to have this conversation even, we could understand so much about also how the world's run now. Who calls the shots when these things happen? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot in restitution that is not just about giving back stuff, but like you said, Leah, stopping to miss out, rebuilding a relationship, querying how things are structured and why we're not learning from things and what we're losing because of that and so on.
So we talked a lot about asking for forgiveness. I feel like we should also talk about forgiving and some of the ideas that we talked about in some of our previous conversations. We talked about forgiving others, freeing ourselves from sort of anger, and I think some dissatisfaction with that idea. So you find that? I mean, that is an experience that people have, right?
Yeah, I just this was in preparation for one of the attempts at this. I looked at, I found this list on the internet. It's like the top 10 podcasts about forgiveness. And they were either some evangelical pastor telling you how to get right with Jesus, or about how you can move on with your life by finally letting go of the people who hurt you. So forgiveness was this way of moving on. And I found myself struggling with that notion a bit because I would have thought that the act of forgiveness is actually about integrating a painful spot in your life. This is why I felt drawn to the story of that I read about of the Lord's Resistance Army and that sort of complicitness. Because actually what happens when we really hurt others is we're building a relationship that's very dysfunctional, that's very wrong. And then forgiveness should also be about ideally making that relationship better. That's not always possible. If that's not possible, then at least no longer giving that relationship that kind of power over me that it has. So it's not about just forgetting and moving on, but it's about really understanding a painful portion. Or like you said, like going to prison and really seeing what the person was doing, seeing them as a human person, is the way of freeing up, not forgetting and somehow saying, yeah, it's all done now, I'm done with it.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think the healing in Paul Kola's case was about integrating that story into the rest of, like, understanding it sufficiently that it made sense as part of your life story kind of thing.
Like, so because those people were no longer disembodied randoms who came off the street. They had faces and names, and they built a relationship.
And for Odong Jimmy, or there's another story I read that was centered around Rwanda. Philip Nigerente and Teresfora Uzabakirio, where one had actually killed the other person's father. Those aren't stories in the Rwanda genocide, right? Those aren't stories you just simply forgive and forget. Like, those are stories of a tragic joining of lives that if forgiveness goes well, something new can come out of that. It will never completely clear the ground of pain, but you will see that there is sort of the sign of heaven or something. There's something coming that shouldn't have grown from that under normal circumstances. And I think that is when forgiveness really comes to its own.
Yeah, maybe an acknowledgement that sin binds us with someone else. So I think we talked at one point in our pre-discussions about forgiveness binding us, but I think really forgiveness is an acknowledgement of the binding that's already there through the sin, and some way of moving forward with that binding. Which might, with an abuser and someone who was abused, we're not talking about now forming a great friendship or having to see them again necessarily, but there's some integrating or acknowledgement of that so-called relationship or that binding between those people.
At least becoming aware of it and finding ways of it not having that power over us. Like, forgiveness can't be pushing it away as if it didn't happen. And this is where that magical Jesus forgives everything idea is again hurtful. Because then we end up with a message of forgiveness. It's like, all right, it's blotted out now, it's cleaned off, we put it in the wash, it's done. But that's not how this stuff happens, is it?
So, Leah, a story that contradicts that idea is the story of the unforgiving servant, which is a very uncomfortable story. That's in Matthew 18, 21 to 35. So, how do you deal with that story? Or does it fit with what we're talking about?
Just explain how it contradicts. Not apologies.
Well, so the point of, well, at least I see it as contradicting what the thing that Jörg was presenting, because like that story is you ask God for forgiveness and then he forgives you and it's gone. And in the story of the unforgiving servant, the servant asks the master to forgive the debts, and then they look like they're gone, but then because of the behaviour of the servant, they come back again. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was kind of saying before about the forgiving and the forgiveness are all linked together. We can, that servant who was the basic story is that there was a servant who was forgiven an enormous debt by a master, and it's like a ridiculous debt that he could never hope to pay back, and it's meant to be an allusion to God forgiving us. And then the servant then goes and finds some puny little debt that he's owed by another servant, and pursues him for all his worth. And And I just see the story as one of God gave so generously, and that servant then had an opportunity to go and give generously himself, and to go and extend that. He was set free. He was absolutely able to go and say, okay, well, no, actually, what you've done to me doesn't matter either. And yeah, so I don't see it as contradicting. I just see it as kind of part of this web of forgiving and forgiveness and relationships. And because you're right, even though the master had forgiven the debt, like you said right at the beginning, your worry, it actually still came with some obligations, didn't it?
And it's not like paying off.
No,
that is really important.
It's forgiving. And he still had an ongoing relationship with the master, because the master had a set of expectations of him now that he'd been freed up. And that's what I love about that story where, the lady who is caught by the religious leaders in some sort of compromised adulterous situation, and then Jesus writes on the floor, and they all want to stone her, and he says, who's without sin should throw the first stone. I think it's a lovely picture of Jesus' forgiveness, although forgiveness is never actually mentioned, because at the end he says, neither do I condemn you. Where are your accusers? They've all disappeared because they realise they can't throw a stone at her. Where are your accusers? And they've gone. Well, neither do I condemn you. Basically, God forgives you too, right? And then he says the thing that I'd always found really hard. It's like, go your way and sin no more. And like the evangelical, I think the evangelical telling of this story is kind of, it all feels like she's getting let a little bit off the hook. So, so we really need to emphasize this last bit, because she really just couldn't go back to her terrible life. She really needed, Jesus was just really clearly making
which all of a sudden was only her problem, not
of course, it was all her problem. Jesus needed to make it really clear that she should. Actually, I struggled and prayed over that story for quite a while, because I really hated that end bit, and I felt like I came to the position where I thought, actually, it's a freeing word. It's there you go. Okay. Go on. You're free. You're free. Those people who were making the problem all yours and forgetting that anyone else was involved, they've gone. Go. That great big debt is forgiven. It's gone. I've set you free to go and sin.
And it enables you to enter into a different relationship with all those men. You no longer owe them anything. You're no longer in their debt of like their ethical condemnation.
Because it's quite clear that they're also fairly compromised as well. So, it's that thing, we're all in this position of needing forgiveness and giving forgiveness.
So if we can somehow find the freedom to like go and sin no more, to actually make a change in our life, if freedom is if forgiveness is like a tool that takes sufficiently reduces the guilt to the point where we can actually act in a good way.
And it doesn't mean not to hold one another accountable. Like the servant who's forgiven a lot is not condemned for asking the other person to pay him back the 200 denarii that he owes him, but it's the fact that he doesn't even think to have the patience with him, and he says, I'll pay you back. So in a sense, it is about rebuilding the relationship, not just about letting go of everything. Because I still feel uncomfortable with this story when we as 3 white people are talking about race and forgiveness, because I don't want to be sitting here implying, well, you don't want to get in trouble with God, so you should forgive us. So, I mean, that's your deal, but my tip would be, I don't want to be in that position, but it should be like, can we rebuild a relationship and you can still hold me accountable? There has to be a continued act of repentance and a reckoning of the debt that's still there. There isn't a demand of the master to say, now I've forgiven you, therefore forgive everybody else the 200 denarii, no longer hold them accountable. That's not what the story's saying.
Yeah, that's what you're saying.
The story is saying, don't close off the relationship because you think that'll never come back, then you end up in a very difficult place. Hold them accountable, help them get better. And this is what I would say in this time, I would love for us to have a conversation where the power structures, the privileges are held accountable rather than everybody going in their corner and saying, we can no longer do with you, we can no longer deal with you.
Yeah, and actually the end of that story is very much a casting off and a severing of relationships, isn't it? So the punishment, if you like, that the servant received is to be cut off from everyone. Yeah,
exactly.
And there's an argument that he's kind of gets the punishment that he was sort of heading himself towards anyway, which is cutting off relationships.
And again, this is not about making any recommendations to anybody who was hurt.
No.
But it's about like this idea of life coming from forgiveness through true acts of repentance that go beyond us going to God and forgive us our sins about racism and then think that's all gone, but actually having a deep recognition of the sin, thinking about restoration and so on. There needs to be a good effort on that side, certainly, to want to rebuild the relationship.
This I've been while we've been talking about these like freeing thing, I've been thinking about personal sin and people that I know who are trapped in like a cycle of shame and like forgiveness being a potential way out of that. And it just struck me, because to some extent that's not relevant to this episode, but it just struck me that maybe there's something to be learned from that story about our collective sin, right? Which is essentially that it's hard. If we really acknowledge these systematic sins and these very old historical sins and the fact that we're still in them, then there'll be a lot of shame, and that is likely to make us despair. And we're going to need to understand some sense of forgiveness from God to be able to start to work our way together out of it.
But it's the only way out. We are in this relationship, right? We can't. There's a sense of forgiveness in which we want to gloss over it, like this person that you were reading from, Leah. Get over it, move on, it's too woke, let's leave it all behind. And there's a Christian version of that. God has forgiven us, we're one community. And then there's the other extreme that just says we can no longer be in a relationship, but we can't escape that. So
our sin binds us together. Even if nothing else did. Our common humanity does too. But
but our sin binds us together in very specific ways, which we need to address.
And going back to that story of the woman, it's like she was in the horrible position of having it all made so public, but actually that ended up enabling her to be set free in a way that the guys who sort of slunk away with their tail between their legs just kind of
because Jesus dragged them out into public. He said, well, okay, who among you hasn't been?
He kind of made the whole system in evidence, didn't he?
It's so hard. It's again so hard to talk about this story without talking about how awful, how horrific it is that the to me the easily the worst sins in this situation are like the systematic abuse of women and stuff like that.
But that's so much how it works, right? So like that's the projected guilt of men onto women. I mean, that's such a thing that happens all the time. Then it's made her a problem. Because there's all the shame involved, and like you were saying, Leah, the men don't get healed either.
So where does Jesus's crucifixion or Jesus's death on a cross fit into this thing about forgiveness?
There's nothing to do with it. Completely different.
So you had something about projection, right? Or
well, I think we've kind of talked about it. If we can get away from, and this comes back to our episode on sin and also on salvation, if we can get away from this narrow concept of Jesus being just this sort of universal sacrifice that needs to be paid so everything is equal,
like paying off a
debt. By actually being that moment in which God allows us to come to a recognition of how deep our sin goes. Because the story is, if I came down to you on earth, and wait, I did come down to you on earth, you even killed God. Your sin runs so deep, you know no boundaries. And that's the Christian story. If I'm before that cross, I see in Jesus' face every slave, every person hit by racism, every person I've wronged. I suddenly come to this recognition, my God, how deep does it go? If that's my understanding of sin. And then you see how then all of a sudden this whole question of forgiveness is linked. I'm no longer asking just Jesus for forgiveness, but I'm seeing every person that's wronged in that face, and I'm asking for forgiveness. It's all together in that moment. So if we can break through that understanding, and then seeing resurrection as the place in which we receive salvation, because this new life from God comes toward us, like we see blooming up in some of those Forgiveness Project stories, then we're in a very different place in Christianity and talking about these things. And if that then becomes the cycle that we get to live through every day, that we become aware of the systemic sin that we live in, and yet go out every day in that hope that God's new life will break through and we can be different, and we will be different, that's a completely different story of the cross that I think is biblical, but we don't hear often enough.
We can't do that if we're thinking it as an individual, right?
No. It's about. I mean, the whole biblical story is about humanity. The fall isn't about Adam and Eve. It's a story about humanity. Jesus becoming a human, becoming like us, and taking upon himself that hate is a story about humanity. It's not just about the private little sins or things that we do. I mean, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the section called Alternative Visions. It's getting pretty late on a Friday night, so
the visions get bigger.
we're gonna try and figure out whether we have an alternative way of seeing the world, but we're not going to take all night about it. Leah, we had this phrase about forgiveness, recognizing that the other person is broken. So, do you have more to say about that?
I think, I'm kind of this is like a summary section, right? I'm struggling.
Yeah, this is a bit where we give all the answers.
This is where we kind of sum up what we said. Yeah, I think
as we do in every episode, Leah.
Yeah. So we come up with all the answers. Yeah, well, it's just too late in the evening for that for me. Yeah, we can't stand aside and say, I am in this section of people who have been wronged, or I am in this section of people who haven't been wronged, and I'm the one that needs to do the forgiving. We're all in this together, aren't we? We all fail to live up to the image of God that has been put in us, and we all stand broken in front of the cross.
Yeah.
And forgiveness feels, by the end of this evening, forgiveness feels like it has more to say as a way forward from that place than it did at the beginning of this evening. So I guess that's progress.
Yeah, I mean, and forgiveness and acknowledging that everyone's broken is not the whole story, right? There's also acknowledging that there's a way forward for everyone, including ourselves, but also including those people that we might have thought are beyond the pale. If you're talking about forgiveness, you're talking about there actually is a way forward. The people can, relationships can improve, or people are not lost and thrown away.
Yeah.
You don't forgive someone because they're too bad to be ever forgiven, right? So acknowledging that there's a way back for us is important, and acknowledging there's a way back for other people is important too, right?
But it also reminds us that it's important, and this is, I think, the moral of the Belarusian story, isn't it? That repentance is such an integral part of enabling forgiveness. So we're not asking others for forgiveness, but by repenting before God and asking God for forgiveness, we are acknowledging our brokenness and are facilitating our brothers and sisters' ability to forgive us. That makes sense? To actually dwell on the colonialisms of the past is important for that reason. That we make visible the brokenness, that we are aware of the brokenness, that we hear the stories. I mean, this is another strange way of talking about colonialism that then centers us again around the European story, and who's in the middle point of that is again the Europeans. But actually hearing other stories of migration, of racial disparity, the kind of stories we heard on this podcast, that just acknowledge the brokenness on all sides, and that hopefully enable forgiveness as a way of rebuilding a different relationship.
Yeah, and so I feel like we've talked this evening about getting forgiveness from God, being a thing that can free us up, removing the guilt. And David, even in that horrific story that it's hard to relate to, David talks about in what did you say it was, Leah? Psalm
51.
Psalm 51. David says, "You've removed the
blood guilt. I think.
Yeah, deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed." So he's asking God. Hopefully, God did that. I don't know, but yeah. So by delivering us from guilt, it potentially frees us up to then do those things we talked about, the repentance and the restitution. And again, it's the beginning, not the end.
Yeah. And I think some of that, this is where the vision of heaven, I think, comes in helpfully. We've had discussions about heaven on those podcasts already, but there's a sense in which if we think this earth is going forward toward a different future, then to imagine a place in which that brokenness is visible and enables people to embrace each other in a different way, I think that can enable a different view here on earth. I don't know if that's making sense, but I had a relative who died, and the only image of heaven that I could see in that relation was this person and another relative who I understood very well, but who didn't get along, actually being able to see in one another the things that I saw,
right,
and embracing. So like once that there's a vision of heaven that can motivate us to say, okay, there's a different way of seeing one another, a more pure way of seeing one another that can enable forgiveness fully. And what if we acted a bit more like we're actually going toward that place today?
Yeah, if heaven's breaking through, there is that sense of heaven breaking through when you hear these forgiveness stories.
There is, because suddenly you're like, this is not how it normally goes. There's this sort of weird life that breaks through, and that's the hope. That's the Christian hope, that this is possible.
Yeah. So what should the rich countries do in the light of colonialism and slavery and or the global racial disparity and local racial disparity?
Well, I really hadn't thought, as Jörg said, about migration. If there was some way of just putting some new thoughts into the migration debate, because I think even really kind of genuinely kind, quite well-meaning people will still say, well, it's obviously really tragic what's going on in these countries, but we don't have room for them here. We can't accommodate them here, and
usually the key word is we can't accommodate everyone, which I love in those debates. It's always it's zero or all. That's how.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm missing from that that viewpoint is any sense of obligation that might be honest because of historical situations. And I like that as a new way of thinking, that actually do we not owe people some, not just because of common humanity, but do we not owe people some kind of share in the riches that we all enjoy, that were partly grown on the backs of slavery and colonialism? It's interesting. Interesting.
This is not just the white man's burden.
Not that we should take care of people, just that we let them in. We don't turn their boats away, right? We just kind of let them come here. This opportunity to work hard or not work hard when they get here, that's entirely up to them, but at least let them in.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I totally agree, and I think there's no point discussing it in the current political climate, because it ain't going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. But
maybe that's silly, because if we
I'm thinking of those discussions with the well-meaning people. Right. People who genuinely do care and do feel that we should do something, but that missing from those conversations is always that sense of obligation.
But also relationship. If those well-meaning people knew one or two people personally, if you've been to a country, if you've been to a refugee camp, and you've been asked by somebody, and you've had that relationship, it looks very, very different all of a sudden. There's a very different sense of obligation, saying, well, we can make some room. We should be able to figure this out. And it's a broken down set of relationships. This is why closing borders is so efficacious, because it also disables or housing asylum seekers in shut off places, as it's often done in Germany, where and those, of course, quite understandably turn into the trouble spots in town, because there will be a few very traumatized people who are held there for 3, 4, 5 years without a chance to work. That is never a good recipe. But enabling even just those conversations, just seeing it. I mean, Leah, remember when we went to the refugee camp in France with just a group from church? It was just so real, and it changes your perspective.
And I think also the stories that you see when there are refugees who have become integrated in a host community.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the breadth of people that will get involved and turn up to town hall meetings and write letters and and demonstrate to say it's not right to send these people back to somewhere they don't know or whatever. It's because people have got relationships
and ask
and they know
one of them, if it's a colleague or whatever, dear listener, ask one of them how many people they support in their home country, how many people they're seeing through schools, how often they send medicine. And I want to bet you'll be astounded by the kind of solidarity and transfer that happens. And in fact, remittances are now higher than any kind of development.
They dwarf all the development aid now, don't they?
Yeah, they're higher. Not necessarily dwarf, but they're higher.
Okay.
They're the majority. Yeah, and it's rising, and it's huge banks that are cashing in on it. That's another debate to have on that one, Western Union, etc. Absolutely. But Leah, last time also you said something important, I think, in our last attempt, is that another chance that we're missing to have this conversation is also climate change. And around COP26, where it's like we're having this conversation as if we are, all right, sure, we'll turn out the heat so your island won't flood. It's an act of grace. But actually realizing, wait a minute, there's an extractive economy that has created severe disparities, and now we're hurting countries with climate change. A lot of the conflict in Africa, not all of it and not entirely, but a good portion of it can be explained by climate change. There's a story about Boko Haram that all comes back to the drying up of lakes and fisheries and so on, when you look at who actually engages in these rebel groups. Tells some of it in Ethiopia. There is an element of overpopulation, etc., etc. There's other factors playing a role, but climate change is playing a much, much bigger role than is often acknowledged in conflict, that we often tend to say, oh yeah, it's those countries again. They just don't know how, etc., etc.
Yeah.
No, we're in this together, and we don't want to acknowledge that. That's what forgiveness can help us do.
And what's interesting there, on the climate change thing specifically, is there is actually, built into the current agreements, some level of acknowledgement of the responsibility of countries that have been polluting for a lot longer. So in a way, the door is open a crack to that argument, right? Maybe we think it should be much bigger emphasis on that.
Put some money where your mouth is, yeah.
The worry that is that a lot of it will be as loans rather than as gifts, and then they come with strings attached. And
I mean, what I'm thinking of, what I'm thinking of as the current acknowledgement of that is that the targets for the countries that have been polluting for longer are earlier and more, higher or lower or whatever targets at the moment. So there is, I think that disparity is just. Maybe it should be a lot bigger, but there's some acknowledgement of that kind of that debt, if you want to use the phrase I don't like, but Right, so that's what we should do. Some of those things and stuff like that, and we could go on for a lot more about like what should the Church of England do in the light of the admission of institutional racism, and let alone how should we deal with this in our local church and all kinds of things. But we've been talking for a very long time indeed, so I'm going to stop us there, and I'm going to move to our last section where we do a reading or a prayer, and there I'm going to ask you to read the thing we're going to read this time.
Okay, so we wanted to read the Lord's Prayer because it brings out this thing that I think I've banged on about a lot, about the intertwining of forgiving and being forgiven. So this is from Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9. This is Jesus speaking. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins.
Thank you, Leah. So maybe forgiveness is some kind of unlocking of a rebuilding that we can hope to have. I'm really aware through thinking over this conversation that so much of it has been from the point of view as if there's like an us and a them, and lots of our listeners won't understand the us that we're making the mistake of speaking from. And we tried to speak about our oneness as well, but we're aware of our own weird perspectives that we bring to this conversation. We hope you'll forgive us our sins, listener, although we're not demanding it of you, and we'd really love to hear your perspective. Please do get in touch and let us know your thoughts on this, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Told you